And here we are living with the corrupted fruit, and it's driving us absolutely frustrated. It's making us upset. It's ruining our relationships. It's robbing us of peace. And we keep going to the fruit. Like, what's wrong with the fruit? When really, I've come to find, really, we should be asking, what's going on with the soil?
What a lot of us want inherently is safety, security, and stability. I want to start that right there. Like, what's your take, Joel, on why there seems to be such a huge gap between that desire and then the reality of what we experience in our day-to-day lives?
Yeah, I think that's so good. You know, one of the things that I've come to realize is that we really have two views, two ways or approaches of how we can view the world and we can view ourselves. One is, I'll use some technical terms and just define it as an anthropocentric view. That's like a human-centered view. It's not necessarily bad, but when it goes to an extreme, I kind of call it the unholy trinity of we view the world through me, myself, and I, you know, and that is like the focus is so we're always asking this question, what can I get out of this? And so again, in the context of peace and tranquility, safety, security, and stability, these questions, if we filter it through what can I get or how can I achieve it, it puts the weight of responsibility to experience these things in our feeble kind of human hands. And here's what ends up happening, Chris, is that the more that we try to attain strength, stability, and security by our own means and our own power, the thing that we're actually met with is the presence of our weakness. And if you're like me, it's like the more I'm aware of my weakness, the more frustrated I get. And it's even more frustrating if you view the world through this anthropocentric view because it feels totally defeating. Like, wait a minute, I'm the one who's in control of my life. I'm the one who's responsible to experience stability, not just for myself, but maybe for my family and for my loved ones, for my community. And here I am consistently met with my weakness. And I think what the scriptures do for us, what the Bible does for us, is actually invite us into another way of living. And it's not an anthropocentric view. It's a theocentric or a Christocentric view. So theo, that comes from the Greek word theos, and it's centered. It is a God-centered or a Christ-centered view. And I think this is such a freeing view because what it does for us is it invites us into the strength, stability, and security that doesn't come from within. Like, it doesn't come from my manhandling and trying to control and contrive this thing. It actually comes from outside. It comes from the power and the presence of what Christ has already done. And in that context, we're actually able to then see our weakness, because inevitably we're going to see our weakness, but instead of feeling overwhelming guilt for our weakness and our inability, our weakness actually ends up becoming the perfect place to be reminded, okay, this is that transition point that I need to hand this to God. Matthew 11:29, I think, is one of my favorite passages. It's this passage of Jesus who's talking about an exchange of yokes, you know? And it's really powerful because when he says, let's do an exchange of yokes, he doesn't talk about an elimination of yokes. He says, let's shift this thing around. And then he says, let's shift these yokes. And then he says, take on my way of life. It is gentle and humble. The Greek word is tapianos. And that humble way of life is the Jesus way of life. And then the fascinating thing is, he says, and then come and enjoy my rest. And the rest that we can experience in the way of Christ is a powerful thing because it puts us in a place of acknowledging what we can do and what we can't do, and then resting safe and secure in all that Christ has done, is doing, and will continue to do, because that's just kind of the faithful way that he has been working. And so I think the major gap, back to the original question, I think that major gap is that we're living in a world that is shouting and screaming and pleading with us to take control, strength, and stability into our own hands. And the more we try to do it, the more defeating it is. And it sets us into a spiral that spins out of control. And here along the whole way is Jesus, who's like, hey, let's just do an exchange of yokes. Like, that exhaustion that you're experiencing doesn't have to be. There's actually a way for you to experience true strength, true stability, true security, and to enter shalom, enter my rest. But it actually starts with coming to the end of yourself. Not with trying to make yourself the greatest, biggest, most important thing. It's seeing yourself rightly in light of who God is.
Folks, we got a theologian with us today. This is so good. I mean, you've already, Joel, given us a treasure trove of information, and I want to kind of double click on a few things you said. I mean, I honestly think we could probably spend the rest of this conversation just on your first 5 minutes of monologue, but it's really important. So I want to go to this. Moments ago, you said essentially the more we try, the more we experience hitting this proverbial wall. That's really a statement on postmodernism where a lot of self-help, a lot of mental health conversations, they don't say surrender, they say strive harder. They say life hack your way out of this. And I mean, we could take this wherever you'd like, wherever you think it'd be helpful. But I think as a precursor, it's fair to say, like, discipleship to Jesus is not a life hack. We're not life hacking our way to peace. So we're not looking even in this conversation where people are saying, Joel, Chris, I'm stressed out, I'm ticked off, I'm hurt, I'm afraid, I'm feeling the reflex to self-protect, to self-promote. What we're not going to give people today is a 10-step plan to life hack our way to peace.
No.
You were talking about rest, and maybe we could just go here. Actually, you know what? I want to ask you to comment on postmodernism. First, like, what's your take on really this opposite way? Because the more we try, the harder we try, the more we hit the wall. Self-help says strive. We're saying learn how to rest, surrender.
Yeah.
Say more about that, and then I'll kind of dig deeper.
Yeah, the postmodernism movement, particularly kind of post-enlightenment, with the rise of technological advancement, this is kind of a pet peeve of mine, and I'm glad you asked this question. And some people might be like, "Wait a minute, Joel, I don't know what." So I actually think the more accessibility we've had to information has actually become more damaging than it has actually been helpful. Okay, so and now hear me before people are like, "Now, guys, I'm a fan of my iPhone. I'm a fan of Siri. I'm a fan of these things that make us more efficient and effective. What I'm not a fan of is a type of framing and thinking and living that believes in short-circuiting the process to wisdom and the process for right living. So one of the things that I have just deeply believed in over the last couple of years, especially as I've been researching the concept of humility, the biblical theme of humility throughout the Bible, is this belief that fundamentally the Christian life is slow growth. The Christian life is slow growth. And yet, postmodernism, the Enlightenment movement, it has suggested we don't need slow growth, we need fast growth. We need growth hacks. We need to get from 0 to 6. Think about the marketing for cars and vehicles, right? Like, it's kind of fascinating to me about the marketing for cars and vehicles. It's like, hey, the new car gets to 0 and 60 in like 5 seconds or whatever it is, right? But in what moment in real life are you going to actually unless you actually drive NASCAR, in what real situation are you actually going to take a car from 0 to 60 in 5 seconds? So it's a marketing message to show us the potential of something, but it strips us of the actual pragmatics of, would we even use that? And if we did use that, what would actually happen? The vast majority of us that would try to take a car from 0 to 60 in a couple seconds would wreck the car because we don't know how to control it. We don't know how to do it appropriately. We don't have the skill, the training in order to go there. And so when it comes to the Christian life, I have this belief that the Christian life is slow growth. And Chris, I think that one of the most important prepositions of the Bible is the preposition through. It's the preposition through. And yet we live in a society that doesn't want to go through anything. We want to go around, we want to go under, we want to bypass it. We're trying to save 2 minutes on our iPhone maps or our Android maps in order to get to none of us want to be delayed. And yet consistently throughout the Bible, think about it this way, it was necessary for the Israelites to go through the Red Sea. Why? Because it was through the Red Sea that they experienced the provision and the providence of Yahweh who parts the Red Sea. It was necessary for the Israelites to go through the wilderness. Why? Because it was through the wilderness that God showed them, taught them consistently for a period of 40 years to rely on the provision of God. It was necessary for Jesus to go through Samaria. Why does he have to go through Samaria? To meet the Samaritan woman, the first evangelist of the New Testament. Like, why does Jesus have to go through the cross? Because it's through the cross that the family of God is brought back together into the household of God. And so the biblical narrative is structured with the preposition through. And yet the postmodern movement does not want us to go through things. It wants us to go around and under and short circuit the process. And I just have consistently found that this idea of the Christian life being slow growth, well, what is it growing? Paul is consistently using the metaphor of agriculture. Galatians chapter 5, the fruit of the Spirit, right? And we're left asking this question, well, Paul, what is the soil of the fruit of the Spirit? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, right? What is the soil? Well, I've come to find it's not just me. It's all kinds of Christian thinkers and scholars, the Desert Fathers. I mean, you can go back. And what we've actually found is that humility is the soil of the Christian life. That all of the fruit of the Spirit are fragranced by humility. It's the humility, and then it comes from Philippians 2:8-9. It's the humility of Christ, that Christ leaves divinity and comes into humanity to take on humanity while remaining fully God. I mean, this is a powerful, powerful concept. And here's the thing, Chris, about soil. Soil has to be cultivated. It has to be taken care of. It has to be tended to.
Yes.
If you leave soil alone for any period of time and you let roots, weeds, things, foreign objects in there, it will corrupt the soil, and inevitably corrupted soil produces corrupted fruit. And here we are living with the corrupted fruit, and it's driving us absolutely frustrated. It's making us upset. It's ruining our relationships. It's robbing us of peace. And we keep going to the fruit. Like, what's wrong with the fruit? When really, I've come to find, really, we should be asking, what's going on with the soil? What has gone into the soil that we need to address? Because that soil is the soil of humility.
Joel. What in the world? Okay. Let's unpack this a little more. The phrase going through is so critical. It's interesting. I'm reading a book right now called The Critical Journey, Hagberger and Gulick, and they talk about 6 stages of our faith journey, and you hit stage 3, whereby you were active in serving the Lord or active in life, and then we hit this wall. Scazzaro, in his book Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, talks about this exact situation, and he talks about the need to go through. Let's double down on this, Joel. What is our motivation? Is it fear of lack? Is it fear of losing control? That we are perhaps even neurobiologically motivated to go around, to avoid, to shirk from the hard stuff versus going through, when in fact the going through, let's just kind of paint this picture through the metaphor of seed and soil. I'd like to propose that going through is the process by which the soil of the heart is rototilled and cultivated. I think about Hosea 10:12, break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord. The going through, which is so necessary for maturity and stability in life, creates the ideal environment for roots to go deep. And then this perhaps is a commentary on fast growth, self-help, versus slow growth, whereby the growth is not only slow, but it's thorough. We are becoming effective and rooted. What else would you want to say through the lens of, folks, listen, you're facing a wall right now. You're facing turmoil right now. Hold tight. He who promised is faithful. He will never leave you or forsake you, but you must go through. What do you want to say?
Yeah, I want to go back to, what is the fear? What is the fear of the going through? And I think this is an important one, because we need to deal with the there are these hidden conversations that are happening in the human heart that we're afraid to expose to the world. And so in the section of the book, I have a section called Hidden Pride. We talk about hidden pride and these like little sayings that are happening inside of the human heart and what's happening and how it presents itself. And so with this, like, what is that fear of going through? I think that one of the fears of going through is the cost that it's going to have. At some level, like, we understand that there is a cost associated with the going through process, and underneath the through question and the cost question is a trust question. Do we actually trust that God is who he says he is, and in who he says he is, that he's going to not just lead me, but walk with me and carry me even at times when I can't walk on my own. And on the other side, it might be painful, it might be a journey, and yet the journey is going to be good. So there's a trust issue. And again, I just go back to that anthropocentric versus theocentric view. If fear leads us to a place of disbelief and distrust, and this is actually an echo of Eden, right? Like, this is what's actually happening with Eve and Adam in Eden. Is God actually good? And it's a question of curiosity that's actually seductively laced with this sin at the very core of it. And it's this question of like, if I don't believe that God is good, then who is going to be good? Well, then I must be good enough for myself. And if I'm good enough for myself, then but here, notice what's happening here. Our vision goes from wide lens to tunnel focused, right? This is what fear does for us. Fear is actually blinding us from seeing the horizon and seeing the wide breadth and width of God's creation and of God's providence and his work in our life. And fear is actually inviting us to be tunnel visioned and to only see the thing that we fear, which means that we are robbed of the things that can get us out of that place of fear. And so this is where that through preposition is so important, because in order to even first get to the place of through, I would argue that we actually have to retrieve this biblical view of humility. And so what is this? What is humility? I view humility as three things. Humility is first and foremost knowing God. Right? There's this famous saying, Chris, it's actually attributed to C.S. Lewis. Humility isn't thinking less of yourself. It's not thinking of yourself less. It's thinking of yourself less often, or something like that. I think that's good. Yeah, I think that's good. I don't think that that's bad. But it's very dangerous, Chris, to disagree with C.S. Lewis, right? So I'm not going to necessarily disagree with Lewis, but I might suggest that we want a different starting spot. And so I want to start the conversation of humility not with me, but I want to start it with God. Because if I can first and foremost have an awareness of who God actually is, then I can know who I am. And if I know who God is and I know who I am, that actually equips me to rightly relate to other people. But if I start with me, I throw the movement out of whack. Right? And this is the difference between anthropocentric, a human-centered, versus a God-centered view. And so instead, I want to retrieve this like awareness of who God is, so that I can see myself as a child of God. Like, you're a son and a daughter of the King Most High. And so you should walk with just a little bit of a swagger, but it's not because of something that you've done. It's because of what God has done for you. It's about who your dad is, right? And then, this is fascinating. If you then can retrieve this and then you go, oh my gosh, every image bearer in this world bears the image of God, that will directly impact how you relate to them. It will directly impact how you love them, how you converse with them. And I think about the season that we're dealing with right now in our culture, in just the next couple seasons of this world, of where we live. Like, we're going to step into a political conversation. We're going to step into a religious conversation. We're going to step into a lot of different types of conversations. And here's what I found. Humility is the gift that God has given us in order to regain our true humanity, to live with conviction, to talk with compassion, and to be reminded that you and I are first and foremost citizens of the kingdom of God.
I feel like in so many ways, I want to go back. I've been taking pretty feverish notes here, and I want to go back and wait a minute. He said, what? Oh, we got to unpack this. And what you said, Joel, is that fear robs us of the things that get us out of the fear. That's an interesting paradigm. Will you pull the thread on that? And then I want to go back to awareness.
Yeah. So fear, I think fear and pride are intimately connected. And you might say, well, how are they intimately connected? Because fear suggests to us, when fear turned inward, suggests that we're the only way to get out of it. So if fear turned inward suggests that we're the only way to get out of it, well, this is inherently prideful. And this is the imagery of what pride does for us. I tend to think of pride as a guide. And all along, Pride is this guide, and it's leading us up this mountain. And it's like, hey, the view is beautiful. Like, you've got to see this. And you're like, oh yeah, you're walking up the mountain. You're like, yeah, the view is beautiful. And pride's just just urging you, just like welcoming you along, like, hey, let's go to the very pinnacle. There's this incredible spot that you can take the best selfie you've ever taken, and like, oh yeah, let's do it. And you're walking, and pride is presenting itself as your friend, and you get to the very top, and pride's like, hey, by the way, just go ahead and look over, just lean over the cliff, because you will be mesmerized by this view. And you've trusted pride this whole time, and for the most part, pride up until this point has kind of paid off. Like, yeah, everything that he said has come true. So you look over the cliff, and then what pride does is push you off the cliff. It pushes you off the cliff. And so what pride did was it promised you clarity, but it only led you into deeper levels of chaos. And so humility is totally different. What humility is a guide rail for us. And humility is like, hey, let's go up this mountain. And all on the way, humility is like, hey, be careful where you step. There's a pothole over here. Hey, when you get to the very top, be real careful about that edge, because as beautiful as this thing is, remember, you could fall off, and you truly are human. You're limited in who you are, but there's a great creator, and he wants you to enjoy the beauty of creation without being seduced into believing that you are the goal of creation. You're not the goal of creation. Right? Like, so this is what humility does for us. Humility actually creates and sustains the creator and the created division. Like, we are created beings, and God is the creator. But as created beings, we have inherent value and worth, because God is the one who gave us that value and worth by making us in his likeness and in his image. And so fear is this devastating thing, because fear leads us into pride. And what pride does is it wants to create chaos in our lives. It makes us self-centered. It makes us self-obsessed. It makes us the focus and the point of the entire story. What humility does for us is, in fact, serve as a guardrail for us. And humility gives us the gift of self-awareness, and it alleviates the entrapment of self-obsession in our life.
This is so good. Okay, moments ago you said that pride promises clarity but leads to chaos. Yep. I'd like to propose, and let me sort of draw this mental map out for us perhaps. So if pride promises clarity but leads us to chaos, that presupposes that it in fact blocks awareness. And moments ago you were saying we know ourselves properly to the extent that we see him clearly.
Yes.
I think about Paul in Colossians, our true life, I think it's Colossians 3 verse 4 or 5, our true lives are hidden in Christ. The verses prior, set your mind and keep it set on things above, not on things below, etc.
Yeah.
So like, again, our ability to see ourselves clearly, not in a conceived identity of our own making, self-creation, this is not it. This is when we see him, we'll be like him.
Yeah, that's
for
exactly
we'll see
right.
him as the Apostle John says, for we'll see him as he truly is. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. So here we are, step 2, blocking awareness. When we lose awareness, do we inadvertently decouple ourselves as branches from the vine himself, who's Jesus? In other words, Rolheiser would say it this way, God is always present to us, but we're not always present to God. Like, Joel, walk us through sort of this motion and narrative of the things that block the awareness that we need to see things as they really are. That starts with the pride and the fear.
Okay, so the crux of this actually, I think, is curiosity. I actually think it's curiosity. Okay, so I have this belief, and if you study the Eden story, which I'm always going to go back to Eden. You know, my boss, Lisa Turkers, and I, we do a lot of theology, therapy, but also biblical studies work together. And I credit her for this. She has got me obsessed with these first 3 chapters of Genesis, because there's just so much that's going on. In fact, if you read a lot of Old Testament scholars, a lot of them would say Genesis 1 and 11. I want to extend it to Genesis 12. Genesis 1 through 12. It is actually the paradigmatic chapters that give us every major theme and repetitive story that we need to be paying attention to, because the rest of the Bible just recapitulates, it retells, it restates the stories that are present in these first 12 chapters. So if you want to really understand your Bible, you've got to really understand Genesis 1 through 12. And here are the big movements: creation, anti-creation or decreation, and recreation. 3 very simple, but as our friend Jim Kress says, not simplistic movements. And so in Genesis 1, you've got creation, You have anti-creation that happens in Genesis 3 with the fall, and you have recreation. You're like, well, Joel, where's the recreation? Recreation is actually in Adam and Eve being sent out to continue the work and the mandate that they were given. Just because sin disrupts shalom, it doesn't destroy the purpose of Adam and Eve. God still equips them and sends them out, and they are actually sent on a mission to recreate the world. And then you have the proto-evangelion, the first glimmer of the gospel in Genesis 3:15, I believe it is, where the heel is going to strike the head, and then the serpent is going to strike the heel, that whole thing. But let's go to Eden. What's happening in Eden? I think Eden is actually a picture of God inviting us into curiosity, but it's curiosity with limits. Curiosity without limits is always chaotic. Curiosity in itself is not bad. It's not. In fact, I think God uniquely, he gives Adam and Eve a task. They're to name the animals. They're to cultivate the land. They're actually supposed to spread the land. So my doctoral advisor, Dr. Michael Heiser, who passed away a year from just recently.
He was your advisor?
Yeah, he was my second reader. Mike was my second reader. A brilliant man.
Oh, yeah.
He has this quote I always say, Eden is on earth, but all of earth was not Eden. Which, if you just think about that, will break your brain, basically.
Yeah, it just broke.
Yeah. Eden is on earth, but not all of earth is Eden. Well, what is that? It actually now makes sense of what God is telling Adam and Eve to do. He's saying, take Eden and spread it to the end of the earth. Which, by the way, what does Jesus do as he ascends into heaven? Go and make disciples. It's not a new thing. It's a restatement of the very first thing that God gave to Adam and Eve. We're just picking up where Adam and Eve left off, and Jesus is the one who bridges the gap. So Eden is a place of creativity. It's a place to be curious. It's a place to be truly human. And in fact, Adam and Eve's original status in Eden is a status of humility. They're created from the dust. Adam is created from the dust. The Hebrew word humus, it comes from the Latin word comes from the Hebrew word, and it's all related to soil or to dust, And then you go from there, and then you get this beautiful image, a divine God who on bended knee comes down. And he breathes the breath of life, ruah, into this body that has been created from the dust. So the body is on the ground. And then in Genesis 2:15, it says that God takes and lifts up and places Adam and Eve in Eden. Well, where's Eden? Eden is on top of a mountain. So what actually happens is Adam and Eve's exaltation, their being lifted high, starts from a place of humility. So if you want to be exalted, like if you want to experience that gift that God gives us, it doesn't happen by conjuring with our own power. It actually starts with being returned to our natural state of humility, where that's like the place that God wants to elevate us from. So here Adam and Eve, they're in Eden, they're given a curious task, they're encouraged to be curious, and then God says, and these are boundaries. So God establishes boundaries prior to the fall. Very important detail. Boundaries are not a result after the fall. Boundaries are present prior to the fall, and these boundaries are actually a means in order to maintain peace, establish safety, security, and to give Adam and Eve the ability to exercise strength in a way that is not threatening to themselves or to others, right? And then the serpent comes in. And the serpent says, well, what if you did eat of the tree? Is God holding something back from you? And so what the serpent suggests is that, hey, you actually should exercise curiosity without limits. The limits are the things that are actually God's cruelty upon you. And the interesting thing about the serpent is that the serpent story, you actually find in Isaiah and Ezekiel, that the thing that we find about the serpent is that it was a throne room angelic being. The Hebrew word for serpent, nakash, it can mean a cherub. This cherub would have probably been in the throne room of God. And in Isaiah and in Ezekiel, it says that over time, this angelic being, the language is very important, gazed upon the throne of God and then wondered what would it be like to be God. Curiosity without limits is always chaotic, and it will always result in destruction. And that is exactly what the serpent invited Adam and Eve to participate in. And it's what the enemy is inviting us to participate in, is curiosity without limits. And what humility does for us is it actually is the very gift to regain our true humanity. If you want to be truly human, to exercise all of the benefit and the beauty of Eden, then we regain humility. Humility is the means by which this takes place.
Would this by chance create a commentary on our present day identity crisis that we see pervading humanity? Here's how I'll set it up, because earlier you were talking about how Genesis chapters 1 through 12 create this precedent for us. And I think about Genesis chapter 12, where the Lord comes to Abram and says, hey, leave your family, leave everything that's familiar to you. Go to a land that afterward I'll show you. Now, interestingly, and oh my gosh, I'm actually a little intimidated to ask you this question because I think I've studied this right. But in that, I see this Canaanite phrase that essentially it's a play on words. In my studies, that basically means go and find yourself.
Yes.
But we find ourselves hidden in Christ. So that's typology. What's your take on, if we look at Genesis 12 as a commentary, as a social commentary for what we're facing today, and then couple that with your brilliant statement, curiosity without limits is chaos. What does that say to us? And perhaps, Joel, where is the nuanced clarion call for us to see clearly, to have awareness, as we've been talking about, in this present day where our cultural crisis is, in fact, for identity? Culture says self-create.
Well, Chris, I can officially say that all of my notes are out the window at this point. So you have taken me through an amazing journey, and you're helping me think about this that I've not thought about this in these ways.
Wow,
so
Joel.
This is why I really do believe that theology should always be done in the context of community. So I thank you for that. So I think Genesis 12,
I'm floored.
we can't actually understand Genesis 12 apart from Genesis 10 and 11. So we need to read those three chapters together. So Genesis 10 is the table of nations. There are families, languages, and lands. Genesis 11 is the Tower of Babel. What is the Tower of Babel? The Tower of Babel is actually a ziggurat temple tower. This tower was actually a way that these people that gather on the plains of Shinar, they're trying to force God to come down as they go up. So look at the spatial imagery that's actually taking place. In hubris, in pride, humanity is actually in total rebellion from God. God had told them to go out into the world, and instead they decide to go up and try to force God to come down. At the very top, this is actually ancient archaeology. You can actually find these images, and there's lots of research on it, that these ziggurat temple towers at the very top would have had a room for the deity to come down, and there would have been a temple at the very bottom and a staircase to go to the very top. And so we know pretty significantly that this is exactly what they are building in Genesis chapter 11, and then you have Genesis 12. Well, interestingly, and Chris, the reason why I know this is because a lot of my dissertation is based off of this, so don't get too enamored with where is he pulling all this stuff from. I just happened to spend 7 years studying these chapters.
Thank you for doing it.
So where does Abram come from? Abram comes from Ur of the Chaldeans, and he makes a pit stop in Haran. Well, where's Ur of the Chaldeans? Ur of the Chaldeans is Babel. So Genesis 11 is the epicenter of rebellion because of pride. God, in humble providence, I would argue, reaches into the epicenter of rebellion in Genesis 12, and he calls one family, Abram's family, to be his means, and this is the Abrahamic covenant, Genesis 12, 15, 17, and 22, that all the nations would be blessed through this one family. Now, let's just go all the way to Acts chapter 2. In Acts chapter 2, the disciples are in truly the most humble position, humble posture. They're believing that that what Jesus said is going to happen, and all of a sudden, the Spirit of God comes down onto the disciples. Peter gets up and he gives this epic sermon. Now notice this, that the Spirit is coming down, but there's a detail in Acts chapter 2 that's very important. And that detail is, it says that all the nations are gathered at this time, and it gives a list of the nations. If you took on a map the list of the nations of Acts chapter 2 and placed it up with the list of nations of Genesis 10, they're the same geographical location. So Acts chapter 2 is a redemptive reversal of the impact, the effect of Genesis 10, 11, and 12. It's the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, because here are all the nations who are represented. And notice the crux of all of this is humility. Here are these humble followers of Jesus who don't have any power in and of themselves. And in humility, they're dependent on the power of the Holy Spirit to come, fall upon them so they might speak with power, speak with strength. And this is a fascinating detail, Chris, that as a result of these early followers of Jesus who grasp on to the humility of Christ, the Greco-Roman world of the New Testament is totally changed, totally pulled upside down. So much so that the Greek word for humble, tapienos, it was overwhelmingly, almost exclusively negative. Nobody in their right minds is running around saying, I'm humble. In fact, for the Romans to hear Paul suggest that the church in Corinth, Galatia, Ephesus, that they ought to be humble, they'd have been like, you have lost your mind. It would be like walking around with a scarlet letter on your forehead. Like, you would never do that. And yet, humility ends up being the identifying virtue of these early followers of Jesus, which actually spreads the family of God and multiplies it in ways that it's not even numerical. Like, you can't even really trace it, other than just the fact that the more they're persecuted, the more they grow. And at the very crux of this entire thing, at the very center of it, is humility. It was the humility that they found in Jesus that they then deploy in the way that they lived, in the way that they loved, in the way that they acted. Sorry, I just gave you like a whole seminary class. My bad.
No, I'm real good with this, and I'm curious. Again, it just pokes layers deeper than what you just shared. I'm thinking about humility, and I know this is the central theme of your new work, which is just so good. Do you think, Joel, there has been a level of drift in the body of Christ, in all of us, a slow drift away from humility and an unintentional grappling with or attraction to self-protection, centered upon my own will? Here's why I ask that is, Richard Foster was on the podcast last year. We talked about humility in this way, and then here I am today talking to you in the same theme, and I'm just asking myself, and now sort of reflecting upon my own journey and going, where has the drift been because of fear, where we started today, because of shame, like Genesis 3, to hide, to separate, to make clothes for myself, because the geolocation of my soul, when the Lord says to me, Chris, Joel, where are you? I'm like, I'm afraid because of prior past unresolved disappointment. Yeah. When we have unremitting life experiences that confirm our deepest fears, because you were talking earlier about going through the hardship, going through the adversity, folks, lean in and listen. There's a cost to this. So Joel, I'll break this into two parts. What is actually the cost then to true humility? It costs us something in order to receive the blessing of humility. When we have unremitting life experiences that say, Lord, why would you ask me to do this, when the history of my life experiences say it's all bad? Like, how do we not develop or buy into the reflex of self-protection, self-promotion, isolation, decoupling from the vine, hiding in shame, and not taking on the posture of humility, but instead going at things from an egocentric motivation that is like, well, got to watch out for number one. Yeah. Because that's I'd say a normal fear-based reflex to life, but it doesn't mean it's healthy.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. So what is the cost of humility? I think the cost of humility is vulnerability. It's vulnerability. And in Eden, I'm obsessed with Eden. In Eden, Adam and Eve were in a truly vulnerable status. But here's the thing about it. They had no need to fear. So the English word vulnerable comes from a Latin word. It's a noun and a verb that means to be wounded. It comes from the idea of to be wounded. So to be vulnerable is to open yourself up to the potential, the possibility of being wounded, right? So that's that sensitivity. That's that intimate kind of connection to it. And so here Adam and Eve, they're vulnerable in Eden, and it's a place that you are open to being wounded. But here's the thing, they have no fear of being wounded by God, because God's not going to wound them. So where's the wounding going to come from? in a tragic scene, Adam and Eve are wounded by themselves. They had no fear to be wounded by God, but they ended up wounding themselves through sin, through selfishness, through this lack of returning to the Lord when this question kind of happened. And so the cost today of humility is to risk vulnerability. But here's the payoff. Like, here's why I think we should fight for this, because humility invites us into a posture of honesty. Fear and pride, it leads us to a place of hiding. You touched on it in Eden. And humility is like, no, let's get out in the open. Let's be honest with ourselves. If we can be honest with ourselves, we can be honest with others. And the only way to be honest with ourselves and to be honest with others is to first and foremost have an honest relationship with God. And so this, I think, is the cost of it. And this is why I think so many of us are a bit fearful. I am fearful of humility because the cost is vulnerability. But here's what I found. The more vulnerable that I am in appropriate places. So a chapter in my book, I talk about humble boundaries, right? So this is not what I'm not saying. So hear me really clearly on this. I'm not talking about a type of reckless vulnerability. No, I'm talking about a type of vulnerability that is appropriate, that is established through a means of trust, that, and that chapter really unpacks what humble boundaries are. And in that place, you can actually find and regain your true humanity. You can find peace. You can deal with your fears. You can face your fears and get through them. And then what you'll find with biblical humility, Chris, is that biblical humility is a protection, a prevention, and a preservation. And so what biblical humility does for us, and I say this importantly because it's starkly different from whatever type of brand of humility the world wants to kind of shuffle at you. Biblical humility is a protection. It protects you from thinking too low of yourselves, right? It won't let you think too low, because if you think too low of yourself, you're inevitably going to be stepped all over, and nobody wants to get stepped over. But humility is a protection. Humility is also a prevention. So it protects you from thinking too low of yourself. It's a prevention. It prevents you from thinking too high of yourself. Because if you think too high of yourself, inevitably you will be the one who is stepping over other people. And humility is a preservation. It preserves you. It keeps you rooted in the life of Christ, which is the safest place for you and I to live.
I do want to take a quick TV timeout, folks. Joel's book, The Hidden Peace, it's available right now, wintoday.tv. Head to the show notes. It's available everywhere books are sold. Yeah, it's phenomenal. Joel, I want to double down on this piece of humility a bit, because this plays into the need to shun the reflex to self-protect, self-promote. So you talk about this in the book, and I was captivated by this thought, so I'll have you unpack it. What does it mean then to own our lack of strength, security, and stability, like in and of ourselves? What does it mean?
Something fascinating that's happened to me, Chris, is that the older I get, the more white hairs I'm getting. It's this wild thing, and it's insane, because my Instagram ads and the Target stuff, it's always like, hey, here's your hair coloring, here's how you can remove all your white hairs, and it's like there's a $1 billion industry based off of this. And what I find so interesting about it is I can color, and I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm not here to give that. I'm just saying, what is the sociological impact of this? Well, it's actually ancient. There's a reason why the story of the fountain of youth has permeated throughout society and has permeated throughout cultures. We have forever. We've been trying to figure out, how do we remain youthful? How do we, and why is that? Because the more white hairs I have on my face, on myself, on my hair, and my beard, it is, and I feel this, right? Like, it is evidence of my weakness. It's evidence that aging isn't going to happen to me. It is happening to me. And so, what does it mean to rest in your weakness? The famous, incredible theologian J.I. Packer, he has this little tiny book. And in the book, it's titled "Weakness is the Way." And I just love that title, and I love what he communicates in that, because I do believe it's so true of our life, that weakness is, in fact, the very thing that God graciously allows to take place in our lives to remind us of our limits, to prompt us to turn to his limitless ways, his limitless strength, his limitless wisdom, his limitless knowledge. I mean, we could go on and on. There's this fascinating story in the Old Testament about Jacob. It says that Jacob wrestled with God. And at the very end of that text, Jacob, God touches him on the hip dislocates the whole 9 yards. And the text says very specifically that Jacob limped the rest of his life on the way to Peniel. Now, here's the thing, Chris. If I'm Jacob, I'm kind of like, I just wrestled with Yahweh. Like, he touched my hip and dislocated it. So on the way out, I might just try to stop Yahweh and be like, hey, by the way, do you mind retouching my hip and putting it back in place so that I don't, because this is the ancient world. If you walk with this is going to be detrimental for the rest of your life, I've come to the conclusion, actually, that limp was not a sign of God's displeasure in Jacob's life. It would actually be a holy humility marker for him the rest of his life, to take him back to this place where he actually received the blessing that came from God. And Chris, all of us are walking with this limp, either physically or my friend Catherine Wolf, who's part of this ministry, Hope Heals, she talks about the invisible wheelchair. And we're all walking around with some type of visible or invisible, like, sickness or weakness or whatever it is. And what the Lord is inviting us into is to see that thing not as God's displeasure, but as the perfect place for you and I to be invited into an exchange of yoke so that we can receive the strength of God and we can experience the peace and the rest that only he can give. And so the more weakness we have and we experience, it actually becomes the way in which we can experience the provision of Jesus.
Okay, weakness is the way. I love that phrase. I'm gonna have to go get that book. I love a theological commentary if you have one, because you're stirring so much in me right now, and I'm thinking now about, okay, Jacob and this limp, and then I also think about 2 Samuel 9. Mephibosheth is called to the house. He's called to dine at the king's table, taken out of Lodabar, and he dines at the king's table as one of the king's sons. And the very last verse in chapter 9, I believe, says, and he ate at the king's table continually, and he was still limp. He was still crippled in his feet.
Yeah.
What's the commentary or perhaps connection then, or picture for us to gain from the fact that the Lord, in his steadfast love, calls all of us out of our own Lodabars while we are crippled and lame in spirit, and he says, come dine at the king's table, and yet we're still with the scar, we're still with the limp, we're still with the memory. Like, I think it's well said this way. Like, when the Holy Spirit comes into our lives, it's not like we develop amnesia about our past.
Right.
Is there a commentary or takeaway that we should learn, Joel? Doubling down on the phrase, weakness is the way, and looking at the pictures of Jacob had the limp. Mephibosheth was called out of a land of desolation to dine at the king's table, and he was still lame in his feet.
Yeah, let me add another one to that, is the banquet table in Luke. The banquet table in Luke, and it's a story about this king who invites all these people in, and we have to understand the banquet table in Luke within the context of the risen Christ. Why is it that the risen Christ has marks of his This is Jesus, the Son of God. God himself. In his risen, resurrected body, he has the marks of the cross that he bears on his body post-resurrection, Chris. Those marks don't go away. Why is it? Why is this? I think this is what Packer gets on, and I think it's what you've touched on with Mephibosheth. I think it's what's happening with Jacob, and here's what I think. I think that weakness actually ends up being a means of sanctification for our lives. Weakness is actually a means by which God is helping us to become more like Christ. That's what it means, that, like, how blessed we are to share in the suffering of Christ, because it's actually making us and turning us and growing us in the life of Christ. And in this banquet table story in Luke, it's fascinating that the king goes to like all the VIPs, right? Like the celebrities, the who's who's, and all of them are like, I'm busy, I can't do it, I can't make it, I got other plans. And so then he gets angry and he tells his servant, he's like, hey, I want you to go and get all those that are blind, all those that are lame, all those that are weak. I want you to go to the underpasses, which by the way would basically be the place where all the homeless people are, all the people that are on the outside of society. Bring all those people in, invite them in, and invite them to the table and have them enjoy this massive feast. And you know what's so fascinating about this entire story is not once do we find any indication in this moment that the king or that Yahweh, the God, heals them. They're in that condition as blind, as lame, in their homeless clothes. They come, they're welcome, and they participate in this wedding feast, in this banquet feast. And so what is this all trying to communicate? I think it's trying to communicate to us that weakness is not something that we should despise, because it's in a profound and divine way that through weakness we actually get to experience the suffering of Christ, the resurrection power of Christ, and it's actually turning us into, it is forming us into our true humanity. And so think about it this way. Would you be, Chris, the person you are, void of the A, B, C, D, and F weakest, most vulnerable, most heart-aching moments of your life? You'd be like,
no,
well, no.
Not at all. No.
Not at all. You know? And so
I don't like the scars. I don't like the scars. I don't like, but maybe that's just, this is the history we have. This
is the reality of living in an imperfect world.
There it is.
That has
That's
been
the word.
marked and broken by sin, and yet sin will not have the last answer. Sin will not have the last dance. Sin is not the one who has the final say. Jesus is. And only Jesus could take our marks of defeat in the world and actually turn them into marks of victory. And I think this is what's happening with his marks, like in the resurrected body, is like, y'all saw a cross as the ultimate sign of defeat. Well, I'm going to flip it upside down and make it the ultimate sign of victory. Think about this. Think about the exaltation language here. Jesus in humility descends. He's lifted on a cross, the ultimate sign of defeat, but in the lifting, in the exaltation, he becomes victorious. The most humiliating moment in the life of an individual would have been to be hung on a cross. In that total humiliation moment, Jesus in humility invites us to participate in exaltation so that we can participate in the ascension of Christ, that we're seated at the right hand of the Father now. Well, there's no way that Jesus gets to the ascension unless he goes through the crucifixion. And that is the power of humility at work. And he bears the marks of the cross. To not bear the marks of the cross would almost be a type of dishonoring of what he went through. And so in this upside down, paradoxical way, even these marks of weakness turn into marks of honor because it associates us with the life of Jesus.
Wow. Okay, so perhaps we take this a step further then. Could it be the case that when we misunderstand weakness and we misinterpret it through a lens of, a motivation of fear and shame, that more easily catalyzes an insecure disposition from which we work out life? I want to spend some time on insecurity with you. You talked about it so brilliantly in your book, and this is a great quote from it. You wrote this, quote, "When our insecurity is met with fear, we might consider actions that will compromise our character." So we're back full circle to this. Lack of humility, presence of fear, presence of insecurity. Pull the thread on that, Joel. Fear drives insecurity, which creates what kind of internal posture that demands and normalizes a frenetic, haphazard approach to life.
Yeah, I think insecurity ends up becoming this place where you begin to ask these internal questions of identity-forming things. Am I worth it? Do I have value? Do I belong? Do I have anything to provide or to give? And it's in the tension of asking that question and receiving the answer that I think insecurity lives, right? And you're just waiting for some type of answer to be given to you to give a relief of that insecurity. And so if your insecurity is not met with the truth of the gospel, with the truth of the work of Christ, with that. And a lot of times that this happens, it's like other believers, right? Like, I don't want to over mystify this thing. Sometimes just like another person who loves Jesus, loves you, and is like, hey, by the way, like, what's that internal dialogue that you're having with yourself? You know, what are the ways that you're acting? Yeah, I've got my wife she'll joke. She'll be like, I wear my emotions on my sleeve. I guess that's a saying. Like, people will just know. Like, if I'm down, I kind of like can't hide it. It's just like, oh yeah, I'm down. I'm kind of an emotive person like that. And so there's this level of insecurity that comes up. I have this reoccurring nightmare, Chris, that you're going to laugh at this. Somebody's going to ask me what John 3:16 says, and I'm going to blank. Like, I don't know what it says, you know? And it's like, well, what does that say about my insecurity? Here's what it actually says about me. I'll just be personally vulnerable. What I fear is it's going to be like, well, does this guy know the Bible at all? Like, does he actually have a relationship with Jesus? Like, how can we trust? Like, what, you know, all these questions. These are all identity forming questions, but notice the things that are not mentioned in that. Is he a son of God? Is he loved by Jesus? Did Jesus in fact die on a cross for him? Right? And so the questions of insecurity, if it's not met with truth, insecurity becomes the place that you try to answer the questions of insecurity with your own means, your own power. And it's little tiny compromises in those places that become tragic fails. Nobody wakes up one day, in my opinion, this is my opinion, I could be wrong, but what I've experienced, nobody wakes up one day and decides, I'm just going to destroy my life, destroy my family's life, you know? That if you follow it, it's a series of small decisions that were innovated, that were not controlled, that were hidden, that populated and multiplied and grew and compounded until you had this breaking event. And so insecurity often ends up being, I think, the beginning spot of that very first compromise, small character compromise decision that you make. And this is why humility is so, so important in that, because when humility is met with your insecurity, you don't turn inward to get to the answer, you're turned outward, which means for me, practically, I turn to my wife. I turn to my kids. You know, my kids speak gospel truth to me all the time. I turn to my pastor. I turn to my dear friends, you know, and I'm honest with them. And that has been actually a freedom. Like, humility brings freedom in those areas. Insecurity will lead you to bondage. You will be enslaved by insecurity that is not dealt with. And yeah, it's so funny because I think sometimes people think like insecurity met with humility is going to actually create more pain in your life, but that's just not the case. Insecurity met with humility actually gives you freedom from those things that are entrapping you.
It's interesting because I think about a person whose disposition is motivated by insecurity. And so when they would hear a call to humility and vulnerability, there could be this background fear of humiliation. Mm-hmm. I want to go to another quote from your book that I'm so fascinated by. You wrote this quote, "If we lack humility, we are in a position of unguarded vulnerability to humiliation." Several moments ago, you were talking about the root of vulnerability, which means to be vulnerable is to be open to woundedness. Mm-hmm. What would you say to the person who is motivated by insecurity, sort of even wrestling with this conversation today, going, hey, I get it, but I'm a little timid to engage with it, to assimilate it into my everyday life. The lack of the lack of humility puts us in a position of unguarded vulnerability to the very thing we fear, humiliation. Like, take us full circle with that. How does all that play out?
So we cannot control humiliation moments in our life, and that is painful. It's something I didn't want to write about. It's something I didn't want to acknowledge. I tried to find a loophole all throughout the scriptures. Couldn't find it. But you know what I did find throughout it is that when we are rooted in humility, when we are faced with humiliating moments, the humiliation can be placed upon us. But when we are clothed in the humility of Christ, there's no way for that humiliation to get inside of us. right? And so, because what's already inside of us is the Spirit of God, the truth of our identity, the value of our work, the value of who we are, what we say, what we do is rooted in the life of Christ. And so it actually equips us to endure humiliating moments. And it's that endurance that goes back, it kind of dovetails with that weakness conversation, where we come out on the other side and we become stronger. We become better humans. We become more empathetic and compassionate for other people. Like I say this often, Chris, I'm like, if you find a theologian or a scholar or a Bible teacher or a therapist or a counselor who doesn't walk with a limp, don't walk away, run away. Run away. We all walk with a limp, and when we try to hide that limp, and so this is the thing that humility gives us. It gives the ability to endure even the humiliating moments, because even in that we can find something that might be redemptive in it, even if it's just the reality that we are now empathetic with our fellow brother and sister who might endure a similar situation. I've used this analogy, and I'm a huge nerd. My friend Levi Lusko got me into this thing called cold plunging. You may have heard of it.
Levi and I have talked at length. I'm such a nerd with it, and every time I talk to Levi, I'm like, dude, what's the latest?
Yes. So he got me on it. So next time you talk to Levi, you say you had a conversation with Joel.
I will.
And I wrote him a little letter, and I said, thank you for your cold plunge evangelism. I think he's a cold plunge evangelist, and so we've got a little cold plunge thing. But here's the fascinating thing about a cold plunge is, when you first get into the cold plunge, it's so shocking on your body. Like you're like, how do I get and your body neurochemically, like your body is actually going through fight, flight, or freak out. Like that whole thing.
Yeah.
And so you got to decide, you got to make this commitment to like breathe through this thing and to stay there. But here's the fascinating thing is that when you're in a cold plunge, if you had more cold water poured on top of you, you're already submerged in really cold water. So if you have more cold water poured on you, it's uncomfortable. Like you might feel it, but very quickly you can adjust to it because you're already in that posture of cold. It's a totally different experience by just standing on the open and have ice cold water pull, and you're shocked out of the system. This is what I think the gift of humility is. Humility is almost like being in that cold plunge where you're just accustomed to the reality of that, so that when these other moments happen, you just kind of endure. You're like, oh yeah, it's a little bit colder, but you can acclimate so much faster to it because your body has been conditioned, it has been tempered, it has been positioned in such a way. And the last thing I would just say, Chris, is I've got a friend who has gone through like the AA deal, and he had this statement that he met. He's like, I think he just celebrated like 10 years of sobriety, which is just amazing. He says that there's a statement that AA has which says, if it takes you 9 miles to get in, it's going to take you 9 miles to get out. And this is back dovetailing to that through conversation. We live in a society that recognizes, hey, it took us 9 miles to get in, but we want to get helipadded out. we want to get shipped out. Like if it took you 9 miles to get in, it's going to require you at least 9 miles to get out. And if it takes you 9 miles to get out, you get out and you find yourself back from where you started. So it's going to take some more time for you to make progress. So this is again that gift of humility. Is it frees you from the entrapment of self-obsession so that you can experience the power of self-awareness. So hopefully you don't even have to go 9 miles. You're just aware as you're going off track, like, hey, there needs to be a redirection or reorientation. And it's so much easier to make that orientation on the front end than being blinded by pride or being manipulated by fear or being motivated by selfish ambitions to go down a direction. In the end, you just find yourself so off the path that you wanted to be on in the first place.
Yeah, I'm so thankful for you and for this conversation, Joel, because I'd say one of the themes I'm extracting from it is that the very things that we do from a motivation of fear, shame, self-protection, self-obsession, the very things we do to preserve life actually harm us more. And what we're after is strength and safety and peace. Let's land here today. Creating structures for strength, safety, and peace requires, and we've been talking about it through the lens of humility, an opposite way. What would you say about that? The person saying, Joel, Chris, I'm hurting right now. Like, this is real time, and I'm feeling the flickers of life again. I have been in a reclusive, isolated posture Maybe I've even decoupled myself from the vine who is Christ himself. I know I need to get back because in him is safety, strength, and peace. He is the structure. What do I do, Joel?
So I'm going to give you two things. One is very practical. At the very end of my book, I have 13 devotions that you can walk through. That is how you cultivate humility in your life. And there's like a cultivate, a commit section to it that I think is super helpful. And then here's the second thing, and something that you can do right now. I want you to walk outside. I want you to take your socks off. I want you to stand in the grass. And if it's if it's daytime, look up into the clouds. If it's nighttime, stare up into the stars. And I want you to just say this very simple thing. Everything is held together, and I didn't have to do a thing to keep it there. And feel the cold on your feet. Feel the warmth on your face. Feel the cold wind on your face. Like, gaze on the stars and how they're all held together. And just be reminded, John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. And so we're longing for strength, we're longing for security, we're longing for control. But really what all those longings are is evidence that we're longing for Jesus. Jesus is the one who has got ultimate strength. He's the one who's got ultimate control. He's the one who provides ultimate stability. And so you could just make this very simple exercise a part of your routine of saying, okay, I can get through this. Like, I can take the next step. Because here's one very practical thing that I didn't have to do anything to keep together.
Folks, the book, The Hidden Peace. He is Dr. Joel Muddamalle. Joel, anything else today? This has been one of my favorite conversations I've had this year. You are remarkable. This message is necessary. There's just a spirit about you that is rooted, and you have blessed us with it today. I'm so thankful for you. Thank you for being here. But anything else today?
No, Chris, I'm just so grateful for you, and thank you for the conversation. And my prayer, y'all, at the end of this is just very simple, that you would find a rootedness that comes from the humble way of Jesus, and that humility would not be a thing that is a checkbox that you move on from, but you would find it as the soil of the Christian life that you consistently turn to and tend to and cultivate, because it's that worth it. Like, it's worth it.
Joel, tell people where to track with you online.
Yeah, so the majority of my teaching and communication is on my Instagram. It's just at Muddamalle, at Muddamalle. Not many of us out there, so it'll pop up pretty quick. My website is the same thing, muddamalle.com, and then The Hidden Peace is found on all, Amazon, all the major kind of book outlets, and I've got a Bible study also that comes out with it that traces humility through the book of Judges, and so it's kind of an application deep dive where I argue that humility is actually the way to get out of the spiral of sin that's hiding in plain sight throughout the book of Judges. So you could get both of them at the same time.
Joel, what a conversation. I thank you. Thank you for being here today. Wow.
Thank you.